If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, an author and a public historian. Some of my podcasts are born just because I've read a book that is absolutely eye-opening, one that has me sitting back and literally thinking, what the hell? And this podcast is about a book of letters that had me doing exactly that. The book is written in history, Letters That Changed the World, by Simon Sebag Montefiore, which brings together an amazing, wide-ranging collection of some of history's most emotive, evocative, and impactful letters penned from everybody, from Napoleon to Mark Antony, to Princess Elizabeth before she became Elizabeth I, to Stalin, Mozart, Gandhi, Oscar Wilde, but just to name a few of my favorites. There were so many. So, letters. What exactly is the power of a great letter, and why are letters so valuable to historians? The great joy of letters is that they are utterly authentic, utterly immediate, utterly of the moment, and so you're really getting a moment in time and a spark of life that travels down through the ages. And the authenticity of them is the most important thing, because oftentimes with private letters, you can literally hear how great historical figures talk to each other, talk to their lovers, their best friends, and what they're actually thinking at that moment. And so in terms of history, that's just a unique treasure, really, for the historian. But more than that, we see inside people's souls. And some are famous, like Mozart or Stalin or Ramesses the Great, and some are unknown people in just extraordinary situations. I think that was one of the things that I found most remarkable about this particular book. There was a point where I turned onto a letter by Mark Antony. And I thought, obviously I've heard Mark Antony's stories so many times. I knew him through those stories, but I've never actually heard Mark Antony's voice. And that Mark Antony letter, you get the sort of slightly rough soldier's voice, the slightly rough general's voice that was the real Mark Antony. And he's not the eloquent Richard Burton that you see in the movie Cleopatra. And this Mark Antony, the real one, is this grumbling soldier. And he's grumbling to Augustus, the future Augustus, Octavian. And everyone is kind of criticizing him for bonking Cleopatra, basically. And so he writes to Augustus and basically says, I don't know what the issue is. You're sleeping with countless Roman women. What's the difference with what I'm doing with Cleopatra? Why should it make such a difference to the people of Rome? The Roman people don't mind Augustus sleeping with loads and loads of Roman women, but they're very suspicious of a Roman imperator having an affair with an Eastern queen as exotic as Cleopatra. So it actually does make a difference who he's sleeping with, because at one stage she is the enemy of Rome. There's a massive variety of letters in this book. And what's also interesting to me is the different uses that they were put to. And the great joy of these letters, the great joy of letters generally, is that they are basically usable for anything. I mean, you can use a letter to make an appointment with your electrician or a builder or meet someone for a quick drink. But at the same time, you can use a letter to make a very public statement. So, for example, in this book, there's an amazing letter by Émile Zola, a very famous letter called Chacun, which was written to the French president in public and published in the newspapers. And it's really a letter that opens up and exposes the corruption and anti-Semitism that launched the Dreyfus affair in the 1890s in France. And that's probably the most public letter that I saw. But there's many other letters that are written privately. but are actually designed to be read by other people. And then, of course, there are the great diplomatic letters between kings, like, for example, Ramesses the Great. There's the most famous and important letter probably in all of history, which is the blank check letter given by the Kaiser and the Chancellor of Germany in 1914 to the Emperor and the Foreign Minister of Austria-Hungary, saying basically, you guys can do whatever you want. Germany will support you. And if you decide to crush Serbia, it doesn't matter. We're behind you. And of course, that's the blank check letter that effectively caused World War I. And many millions, many tens of millions of people died because of that one letter. So you can't get more impactful a letter than that. But other letters are impactful because they heralded a new period of civil rights, freedom for African Americans, for example, for black slaves, or for women's rights, or just for women's consciousness. So, for example, there's a very, very exotic kind of sexy letter by Anais Nin writing to her lover, the writer Henry Miller. And this is one of the great erotic, messy, madcap, delicious correspondence of all time. And everyone should read the whole correspondence because it's absolutely jaw-dropping. But Anais Nin was also the woman who created the erotic voice of the modern woman in the 20th century. And there are also letters there by Frida Kahlo, the Mexican artist, to her husband, Diego Rivera. And again, these letters were Frida Kahlo really creating a new female art, a new concept, if you like, of how women express themselves as painters, as writers, as women. So Frida Kahlo's letters are quite outrageous, but it also marked this new era. There's also quite a lot of love letters in this book, but quite a lot of the time, these letters are so important because they're actually private insights that you would otherwise never get a chance to hear, but also because they were tensely political. And one that comes to mind is the letter from Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn, for example, or another one, James I to his lover, the Duke of Buckingham. And I think many of the love letters in this book are there for a special reason. For instance, there's Catherine the Great and her lover, Prince Potomkin, who became probably the greatest statesman of modern history, certainly in the last 300 years. But those letters are amazing. I mean, Catherine the Great's letter, she writes to him. She says, you have to give orders to every single hair on my body to resist you. And what have you done? You have driven the most brilliant mind in Europe mad with lust for you. But of course, they were the greatest political partnership of all time, and they conquered the Ukraine, they conquered the Crimea, and, they did many, many other amazing things. And just before I mentioned the letter of James I and the Duke of Buckingham, and there are other gay love letters in this book. And what's interesting, though, is that neither of those two would have regarded themselves as gay in the slightest, because it's actually before the concept of gayness existed. James I is clearly in love with the Duke of Buckingham, but there's no word for it. They're just in love. And similarly, we have Vita Sackville-Vest's letters to Virginia Woolf, not centuries later. And then there's another great series of love letters between Suleiman the Magnificent and Roxolana, the Russian slave girl, who eventually becomes his queen and the mother of his children. And she uses the name Param Sultan. And they wrote poems and letters to each other, amazing poems. And this is really decisive in history, and especially so for the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire at this stage is the biggest empire in the world. So many of these love letters actually have quite special significance in history. Whether it's just artistic, whether it's for the gender, for their gender, or immediately political. Then I wonder whose letter writing style most enamored itself to me personally. I mean, for example, there's Thomas Jefferson in a letter that most people would never know about, writing to his young mistress when he was ambassador in France. And he writes this letter in the style of a conversation between his head and his heart. And anyone who's been in love will immediately recognize this as one of the great brains of the modern times, applying himself not to the Declaration of Independence of America, but to the question of what it's like to be in love and to be so brokenhearted. So that's one brilliantly written letter. But we've also got letters by Chekhov here, who's writing about what he saw among the prison colonies in Siberia as he traveled through. We've got letters by Mozart, which are completely zany and outrageous and scatological, obsessed with things like defecating and fornicating. And when you read this, you realize that that's the sort of manic genius that you actually saw in the movie Amadeus, which created, classics like Don Giovanni. And what you then realize is that this mind was also sort of a frenzy of creativity. And you can see it in these letters, which absolutely shocked everybody when they read them, and including his parents, for example. So, there's some amazing sort of letter writers in here. I mean, Chekhov's letters are very famous. Flaubert's letters are very famous. They both write about their sexual adventures, on their travels, which was a very common subject of letters in the 19th century and in the 18th century. What really interests me is that the author of the book had the entirety of history to choose from here, to add to this book, to make it the most interesting book of letters. And I was then interested in how he actually made those choices. So I called him, and he was very kind and spoke to me, quite in depth about why he chose the letters that he chose. And it turns out that most of these letters came from his personal library in books that he hadn't read in years. And when he did start picking them up, there they were. And of course, as every writer knows, when the deadline comes for your book and your publisher is, kind of calling you nonstop, you suddenly find yourself out of time. And you have to either write or, in his case, make immediate decisions about what goes into his book. So he literally just started grabbing books off the shelves, took pictures of what he wanted, and he did that nonstop for a few weeks and created the book that really had me falling in laughter and had me in tears. Books on letters, I absolutely love them. And I also love Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Letters of Note by Sean Usher. A must read if you like the ideas of letters. But that then started me thinking about if there was a golden age of letters. I mean, letters have been written for over 2,000 years. And one of the most fascinating things about letters, and you see it in this book, is that we also have letters from the ancient world. There are letters from ancient Egypt in there, which were sent between kings and which were then preserved and then found centuries later. We would never know what those kings were thinking or what they were like if those letters didn't exist. So there are great letters throughout history. But obviously, the golden age of letters is when people would actually spend hours writing every day, writing frantically into the night, with poor light, probably by candlelight. Catherine the Great, for example, described herself as a grapher maniac, and she was always writing letters because the more letters you wrote, the more people would know about what you were doing. And it's a great way of publicizing yourself and reaching other people. I mean, the other theme in the book is war, and we have letters by Peter the Great, Napoleon, and, other great generals who wrote letters the day of their victories or the day after their victories. And you can actually imagine them sitting in a battlefield strewn with bodies, smoking from the gunpowder. And they would actually be writing to somebody saying, hey, I just won this great battle. How good am I? And in one of these letters, Peter the Great actually writes to his mistress and he says, come and help me celebrate. But what made the golden age happen really was the availability of paper, the cheapness of paper for the first time. And then, the ability to send it, the beginning of post mail. And that meant people could actually write to people in distant places, different parts of the world. And the effect of these letters was that people suddenly could step outside their home, outside their village, outside their family, and imagine a kind of community that had never existed before. A society, if you like, a European society. So in many ways, the letter, and I think some of these letters in this book demonstrate exactly that. The letter opened up the world to people. And there's another great example in the book from Balzac and Countess Hansa. And she lived in Poland. Balzac lived in France. She actually had never met him, but she wrote him this incredible fan letter. And she was actually the wealthy landowner's miserable wife. And of course, he was Balzac, the greatest novelist in Europe and living in Paris. And she wrote to him, and they began a love affair by letter without ever having met. And when they did meet, they really fell in love. And those letters are actually in this book. That was also, the golden age of letters. And what really ended it was, of course, the telephone, first of all. And then ultimately the internet, email, and then all of the other terrible things that we know, Twitter, texting, sexting, and all of that. But look, I honestly don't think the age of the letter is over. I mean, first of all, I'm so glad that I found this book because it's a celebration of letters that most people won't know. I mean, some you will know. For example, there's a letter from Princess, who later became Elizabeth I, to her sister, Mary I, begging for her life. Quite a well-known letter. But I was quite surprised that I didn't know a lot of the other letters. And just before I finish on that letter, that's actually quite an amazing letter because that's Princess Elizabeth begging Mary I to save her. And what's really fascinating about that is many years later, when she was Queen Elizabeth I, Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote to her begging for her life. And Elizabeth didn't show clemency. She had her killed. And of course, there are other letters that are pretty fascinating. And there are letters in there that thrilled me when I read them. I mean, for example, I'm just looking at one here where there's Rasputin writing to Nicholas II, begging him not to start World War I. Then there's a letter from Philip II, the King of Spain, his admiral, the Duke of Medina, wrote to him about the Armada in 1588, basically saying, "Don't give me the order to launch the Armada. It's going to fail." And Philip writes back to him basically saying, "Just get on with it. It's God's will." And there's some really interesting kind of fun ones. And probably the one that sticks in my mind is a letter by Fanny Burney. And she writes a letter describing how she'd undergone surgery on her breast to have her breast removed. She had breast cancer, and they actually operated on her without any anesthetic at all. And she actually describes it in some quite humorous detail. So this is really remarkable stuff here. And I guess in doing a podcast like this, I secretly hope that people will not only listen to this podcast, but also read, Simon Montefiori's book and start to maybe think that actually letters are a good way to communicate. Because I think everybody knows that an email and a text, you can't put your soul into that. You can't put your soul into one's writing by sending that. One doesn't really care about the words. One just tries to be as abbreviated as you can and sort of slangy as possible. It doesn't really respect the sender. But with a letter, you are never alone as you write a letter because you could imagine someone getting it, someone opening it, receiving it, and keeping it. I think it also raises an interesting question for what historians of the future are going to work with, because we have these incredibly poetic, amazingly written long letters where they're actually just going to have tweets and WhatsApps and emails. And I don't think they're going to have anything that they could actually write about. I mean, that's the trouble. I've read biographies, so many biographies, because there was so much documented evidence from letters that the person actually wrote. You could actually hear their thoughts. But Putin, for example, well, you wouldn't really be able to write anything about him because, there's no personal letters that actually tell you his personal thoughts or dig into his actual personality. All we hear is the rhetoric and the political lip service and the games that he wants everyone to hear, not what he actually thinks. Yet with, say, a biography of Winston Churchill or Joseph Stalin or, Frederick the Great, you have thousands of letters by them, and you can really enter into their minds simply because you can see the thousands of letters that they've written, and you get a sense of their personality. But look, I don't think it's all lost. I honestly don't, because about 10 years ago, we all thought the book was finished, remember? And actually, books have completely recovered. And I think the same will happen with letters, because one of the lessons that we've seen today is that emails and texts aren't secure, and everything encrypted can be decrypted. So I think that people will gradually return to realizing that the letter is a secure way of writing because it can't be harvested by our security services like everything else on the net. like all the digital communications that can be, and therefore I think people will return to writing letters. And I also think that part of this has already started because if you speak to the top spies, the top statesmen in different countries, and I've spoken to people in England and in America and in Malaysia, they'll say, people are actually starting to write letters and write notes now, which they wouldn't have done for the last 25 years, really, because everyone was using emails and believing that those emails were absolutely secure. And of course, they're not. So these things often start at the top and work down into society, don't they? So I think people should celebrate by writing letters now. I'm just saying. Another letter that really caught my eye was from Gandhi to Hitler. And I didn't even know that those two were actually in any kind of correspondence. And it's a great letter because it's two of the 20th century's greatest and contradictory characters. And you can't ever imagine greater evil and greater goodness being in communication, can you? And Gandhi wrote to Hitler. And of course, Hitler never answered these letters, but they're really of immense interest because it shows Gandhi's nature, that there's always a peaceful solution. And what you really need to read alongside this is Hitler's letter to Mussolini on the night before he invaded Russia in 1941. Because in Gandhi's letter, you can clearly see a man who loved peace and really couldn't understand how someone like Hitler could believe that war was the answer to everything, that war and annihilation would answer the issues at hand. And at the same time, Hitler writes to Mussolini, his ally, to break it to him that he's actually concealed the fact that he's about to launch this kind of bloody war of destruction by invading Russia, Operation Barbarossa. And you see Hitler's mind at the very climax of his power when he thought he was absolutely unbeatable. I mean, hubris personified. And why he's starting another war within World War II. And of course, this was the war that absolutely destroyed him. So it's a very, very interesting letter. So there's a lot of evil in these letters. And there's also letters there from Stalin ordering people to be executed. And you see how uncaring and clinical he actually is. And there's letters there from Mao ordering his Red Guards to attack people and launch the Cultural Revolution. There's also letters there from Lenin to Bolsheviks ordering them to hang hundreds of innocent people to make a point. At the same time, you have Nelson Mandela's amazing letters to his wife Winnie, which really do reveal him as one of the 20th century's greatest, most humanitarian of people who doesn't disappoint, actually. And the letters are so stunning and remarkable, and you get to read them here. I think there is great hope in this collection, but there's also so many warnings from history as well. One of the warnings from history is a letter that was sent from Eisenhower. And it's actually a fascinating read because he wrote them in 1944 when he was launching D-Day, the invasion of Nazi Europe in Normandy. And he sat down and he actually wrote two letters. One was to the troops to say, well done, Godspeed and all that kind of thing. We're attacking Normandy. And the second letter that he wrote was the letter that they were to be given if he failed. And he basically, in this letter, takes complete responsibility for this catastrophe. Of course, he never gets to send the second one because the D-Day landings were actually a massive success. But reading both letters side by side is actually amazing because it really lets you into this incredible man's mind. And there's another great series in the book that I love too, which is the Letters of Downfall, the Letters of Goodbye. So one of my favorites is from the Caliph Abdul Rahman III, who actually ruled Spain, Muslim Spain, and he was one of the most brutal and most successful, most triumphant monarchs of Europe. And after 50 years of victory, he wrote to his sons and he said, I look back after 50 years as I lie dying of my triumphs, of my splendor, of my magnificence, of my power, of my wealth. And I realize I've just had 14 days of happiness. And that's such a wonderful letter, such a comment, I guess, on the transience of human success. So another one I love is Henriette, a beautiful married woman's letter to Casanova, the great lover. And normally we would think of Casanova breaking everyone's hearts and behaving very callously. But this is the woman that broke his heart. And this is the letter of a married woman going back to her husband and saying to Casanova, look, we've had this amazing, passionate love affair, but it's over and it can never happen again. And I've loved knowing you. And of course, Casanova never got over it. So there's sort of touching letters like that. But my absolute favorite of the goodbyes is a letter from Hadrian that he sent in the form of a small poem to his friends, a very close group of friends. And of course, this is the Emperor Hadrian, one of the most successful Roman emperors of all time. And he just wrote this, and it's actually so touching. Little soul, little wanderer, little charmer, body's guest and companion, to what places will you set out for now? To darkling, cold, and gloomy ones, and you won't make your usual jokes. And there's another set of letters that completely floored me, and these are from Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, which actually ended up in the pair of them dueling to the death. And these are letters of destruction and doom, and there are a few of them. And what you realize is that they're all completely unnecessary. There's also a letter from Oscar Wilde where, he's received the insulting note from his male lover's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, which eventually leads to, Wilde's libel case, which then leads to his destruction and imprisonment and an untimely death. And the podcast that I did on Wilde goes into it in greater detail. There's also Pushkin's letter in which Pushkin takes umbrage and challenges a young, popinjay who's been flirting with his wife to a duel in which he's killed. But let's just circle back to the Burr-Hamilton letters. For those of you who haven't actually seen the musical, you must see it. It's absolutely wonderful. But these are real letters that led to this destruction. And though they're written in this kind of, incredibly kind of elaborate legalistic manner, you can gradually see through them. And you know at one stage that they're actually going to fight to the death about this. And of course, Alexander Hamilton is probably one of the greatest, most fascinating of the founding fathers of America. And he's killed, totally unnecessarily in this duel of honor. But the absolute best letter for me in the book is by the mistress of Simon Bolivar, the conqueror of South America, the liberator of South America. It's fantastic. And her name is Manuela. And she's one of the most extraordinary women in history, a wonderful character, wild and free. And she's married to a much older man. And she has this incredible affair with Simon Bolivar. And he sends her back to her husband. And so she decides that this is never going to work for her, and she has to write a letter to her husband that really makes it impossible for him to stay married to her. So she writes him this incredibly rude letter. So this is a little bit of the letter from Manuela to James Thorne, her husband, written in 1823. And she says, "No, no, 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 hombre, 1,000 times no. Sir, you are an excellent person, indeed one of a kind that, like, I will never deny. I only regret that you are not a better man, so that my leaving you would honor Bolivar more. I know very well I can never be joined to him, and what you call honor, do you think I am any less honorable because he is my lover, my great lover, not my husband? Ah, I do not live by social conventions. Men construct them to torment us. So leave me be, my dear Englishman. We will marry again in heaven, but never on this earth. On earth, you are a boring man. Up there in the celestial heights, everything will be so English for you, because a life of monotony was invented for you people who make love without pleasure, conversation without grace, who walk slowly, greet solemnly, move heavily, joke without laughing. But enough of my cheekiness. With all the sobriety, truth, and clarity of an Englishwoman, I say now, I will never return to you. You are a Protestant and I a pagan, but I'm also in love with another man, and that is the greater, stronger reason. You see how precise my mind can be. Your invariable friend, Manuela." Love it. Absolutely love it. What a character she must have been. The best letters that I received, I think, were from my mother. She wrote very easily, and she wrote 5, 6, 7, 8 pages at a time, telling me everything that she and my dad were doing because they traveled so frequently. She would write to me from Tanzania. She would write to me from very remote diamond mines in Africa. And what I always found fascinating as a child would be that my father would write 3 agonized lines right at the end of her 5, 6, or 8 pages. And interestingly, that meant more to me than anything. The best letters that I wrote, I think, were from when I was in Brunei. Long letters about what I was experiencing as I was on jungle treks at night. I would disappear back then into the jungles with the army trackers because we were quite close to them. And for months on end, we would just trek and traverse and map. And I had the most amazing adventure. And every now and again, we would come to a village and I would give them a letter that had been written by torchlight that would be sent to my parents. I think I was only 16 or 17 at the time. But the great thing was that they kept them, and I still have them. And it's a great record of my life back then, of adventure, far away. And that's what letters are for. Simon Montefori's book, Written in History, Letters That Changed the World, is out now, and I highly recommend it. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.